The summer sun blazed mercilessly over the naval base at Norfolk, Virginia, as Captain wiped the sweat from his forehead. The annual fleet inspection was just 3 days away, and tensions ran high throughout the entire facility. Ships gleamed under fresh coats of paint, sailors scrubbed decks until they sparkled, and officers barked orders with increased urgency. Had been stationed at Norfolk for 2 years now, commanding the destroyer USS Hampton with what he considered exceptional skill. At 38, he was one of the youngest captains in his division, a fact that filled him with considerable pride. His crew respected him, his superiors valued his tactical expertise, and he had never failed an inspection. Today would be no different. The morning briefing had gone smoothly. His executive officer, Commander Sarah, had reported that all systems were functioning perfectly, the crew was prepared, and their ship would undoubtedly receive top marks. Felt confident as he made his rounds, inspecting every corner of his vessel with the eye of a perfectionist. Around noon, the heat became unbearable. The metal decks radiated warmth that seemed to penetrate through the soles of even the thickest boots. Noticed several of his junior officers struggling with the temperature, their uniforms darkening with perspiration despite the morning's relatively mild beginning. That's when he spotted her. A woman stood near the ship's communications array, apparently inspecting the equipment with unusual interest. She wore a simple white t-shirt and navy blue cargo pants, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. No rank insignia was visible from his position, and she didn't appear to be part of his regular crew. Frowned, wondering how a civilian had gained access to his ship during such a critical preparation period. Security protocols demanded that all visitors be escorted and properly identified. The woman's casual attire and unsupervised presence immediately raised red flags in the captain's mind. She could be a contractor, perhaps, or maybe someone from the inspection team conducting an early survey. But proper procedure required verification. Approached her position, his footsteps echoing against the metal deck plating. The woman seemed completely absorbed in her examination of the communications equipment, running her fingers along various components with the confidence of someone who understood the technology intimately. "Excuse me," called out, his voice carrying the authority of command. "I don't believe we've been introduced." The woman turned toward him and was struck by her remarkably calm demeanor. Her eyes, a sharp green color, showed no trace of surprise or concern at being addressed by the ship's captain. Instead, she simply nodded acknowledgement and returned her attention to the equipment. "I'm conducting an assessment of your communications array," she replied without looking back at him. "The integration of the new satellite uplink systems shows some interesting innovations." Felt his irritation growing. Not only was this person avoiding proper military courtesy, but she was also examining sensitive equipment without authorization. The casual way she discussed technical specifications suggested familiarity, but that didn't excuse the breach of protocol. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification," insisted, stepping closer. "This is a restricted area, and all personnel must be properly cleared and escorted." The woman finally turned to face him fully, and noticed she seemed amused by his concern. Her slight smile only increased his annoyance. Here he was, trying to maintain security during the most important inspection of the year, and this civilian found the situation entertaining. "I appreciate your vigilance, Captain," she said, her tone suggesting she knew exactly who he was. "Security is certainly important, especially during inspection periods." Waited for her to produce credentials, but instead she simply stood there, apparently expecting him to accept her vague response. The heat, the stress of preparation, and now this security breach combined to test his patience. He prided himself on maintaining military bearing under all circumstances, but this situation was becoming increasingly frustrating. "I'm afraid I must insist," said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Protocol requires immediate identification of all personnel in sensitive areas." The woman's smile widened slightly, and she glanced around the deck as if considering something amusing. Several of junior officers had gathered at respectful distances, apparently waiting to see how their captain would handle this unusual situation. Their presence only added to the pressure he felt to resolve the matter quickly and decisively. "Tell me, Captain," the woman said, surprising him by knowing his name, "how do you think your crew is handling the preparation stress?" The question caught him off guard. Not only did she know his identity, but she was also deflecting his security concerns with what seemed like casual conversation. Felt his professional composure slipping as the heat and frustration combined to cloud his usual judgment. "Ma'am, I really must see your credentials immediately," he repeated, his tone becoming more demanding. "I cannot allow unauthorized personnel to examine our equipment." Instead of responding to his request, the woman walked over to a nearby equipment locker and retrieved a bottle of cold Coca-Cola. The sight of the refreshing beverage made acutely aware of his own thirst and rising body temperature. She opened the bottle and took a long drink, seemingly oblivious to his growing exasperation. "It certainly is hot today," she observed, holding the cold bottle against her forehead. "I imagine everyone would appreciate some relief from this heat." Watched in disbelief as she continued to ignore his repeated requests for identification. The situation had moved beyond frustrating into the realm of the absurd. Here was someone who clearly had unauthorized access to his ship, casually drinking soda and making small talk while he tried to maintain security protocols. His junior officers were still watching and knew he needed to establish authority. The success of his command depended on maintaining respect and demonstrating decisive leadership. This strange encounter was undermining his position in front of his own crew. "This is your final warning," announced loudly enough for nearby personnel to hear clearly. "Produce proper identification immediately, or I will have you removed from this vessel." The woman looked at him with what could only be described as mild disappointment. She shook her head slowly, as if saddened by his response to the situation. Then, without any warning whatsoever, she lifted the bottle of Coca-Cola high above her head. "Perhaps this will help cool things down," she said, and before could react, she poured the entire contents of the bottle directly onto his head. The shock of cold liquid hitting his heated scalp was immediately followed by the humiliation of being doused in front of his crew. Coca-Cola streamed down his face, soaking his uniform shirt and dripping onto the deck. The sugary liquid matted his hair and left dark stains spreading across his carefully pressed uniform. Stood frozen for several seconds, unable to process what had just happened. The woman who had just assaulted him with a soft drink was calmly setting the empty bottle on a nearby surface, her expression suggesting she had simply performed a perfectly reasonable action. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" exploded, his voice echoing across the ship's deck. Sticky cola continued dripping from his hair and uniform, creating an increasingly uncomfortable sensation as it began to dry in the heat. Several crew members had witnessed the incident and could see mixture of shock and barely suppressed amusement on their faces. His authority had been completely undermined by this bizarre attack, and he felt his professional reputation crumbling with each passing second. "Security," shouted, his voice cracking slightly with rage and embarrassment. "I want this woman removed from my ship immediately." Two junior officers began moving toward the woman, but she held up her hand in a gesture that somehow caused them to hesitate. Noticed their uncertain expressions and realized they seemed to recognize something he didn't understand. "I think there may be some confusion here," the woman said calmly, reaching into her back pocket. "Perhaps proper introductions are in order." Was breathing heavily, cola still dripping from his chin, his uniform completely ruined. The heat seemed even more oppressive now, and the sticky sweetness coating his skin was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. All he wanted was to see this person arrested and removed so he could salvage what remained of his dignity. The woman a small leather wallet from her pocket and opened it to reveal official military identification. Squinted through the cola residue still affecting his vision, trying to read the credentials she was finally presenting. What he saw made his blood run cold. The identification clearly showed the woman's photograph, but the rank insignia displayed made his heart stop beating for what felt like several minutes. The name on the credentials read Admiral Hawthorne, and below that, in official military typography, were the words Fleet Command Norfolk Division. Felt the blood drain from his face as the full implications of his situation became clear. He had just demanded identification from, argued with, and been assaulted by his direct commanding officer. More precisely, he had been assaulted by the commanding officer of the entire fleet. Admiral Hawthorne closed her identification wallet and returned it to her pocket, maintaining the same calm expression she had worn throughout their entire encounter. Stood motionless, cola still dripping from his hair, trying to comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. "I believe you requested identification, Captain," Admiral Hawthorne said quietly. "I apologize for the delay in providing it." The nearby crew members had obviously recognized the credentials and were now standing at rigid attention. Could see the barely controlled panic in their eyes as they realized they had witnessed their captain being dressed down by the base commander. His mind raced through everything that had just happened. He had treated the Admiral like an unauthorized intruder, demanded her credentials repeatedly, threatened to have her removed from what was technically her own ship, and then been doused with soda in what now seemed like a perfectly reasonable response to his behavior. "Admiral," began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I had no idea." "Clearly," Admiral Hawthorne replied. "I was conducting an informal inspection of fleet readiness, Captain. I wanted to observe how ships and crews were handling preparation stress without the formality of announced visits." Felt sick. Not only had he failed to recognize his commanding officer, but he had also completely failed the very test she had been conducting. His behavior had been the opposite of everything the Navy valued in its officers. "The question now," Admiral Hawthorne continued, "is how we address this situation." Silence on the deck stretched uncomfortably as Captain stood dripping with cola, facing Admiral Hawthorne. Every crew member within sight had frozen in place, sensing the gravity of what had just unfolded. Could feel sweat mixing with the sticky residue on his face, creating an even more uncomfortable sensation as the Virginia sun continued beating down mercilessly. Admiral Hawthorne gestured towards cabin. "I think we should continue this conversation privately, Captain." Nodded wordlessly, acutely aware of his ruined appearance and the curious stares of his crew. As they walked toward his quarters, he caught glimpses of sailors whispering among themselves, their expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed amusement. His reputation, built carefully over years of service, felt like it was dissolving as quickly as the cola was drying on his uniform. Inside his cabin, stood awkwardly near the entrance while Admiral Hawthorne took a seat in his desk chair. The informal way she settled into his space reinforced the power dynamic that had been so dramatically revealed moments earlier. "Sir," began, then stopped himself. "Ma'am, I should clean up before we—" "The uniform can wait," Admiral Hawthorne interrupted. "Right now, I'm more interested in understanding your thought process during our encounter." Felt his stomach drop. This was clearly going to be more than a simple reprimand for failing to recognize a superior officer. The Admiral was conducting some kind of analysis of his command decisions and behavior. "I was following security protocols," said carefully. "An unidentified person was examining sensitive equipment without proper escort or credentials." Admiral Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, studying him with those sharp green eyes. "And when I didn't immediately produce identification, I escalated the situation according to standard procedure," replied, though even as he said it, he began to doubt whether his actions had truly followed proper protocol. "Did you consider alternative explanations for my presence?" the Admiral asked. "Perhaps that I might have legitimate authority to be there." Opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. In truth, he had been so focused on asserting his authority that he hadn't seriously considered other possibilities. The heat, the stress of inspection preparations, and his own pride had combined to narrow his thinking. "I should have been more thorough in my assessment," he admitted finally. Admiral Hawthorne stood and moved to the small window overlooking the deck. "Captain, how long have you been commanding the Hampton?" "2 years, ma'am." "And in that time, how many surprise inspections or unannounced visits have you experienced?" Thought carefully. "Several, ma'am, but they were always conducted by personnel in proper uniform with clear identification." "Exactly," Admiral Hawthorne said, turning back to face him. "And that's precisely why I was dressed casually today. Real-world security threats don't announce themselves with military uniforms and credentials." The implication hit like a physical blow. The Admiral hadn't been testing his ability to follow routine protocols. She had been evaluating how he would respond to an actual security situation, and he had failed spectacularly. "I wanted to see how various ship commanders would react to an ambiguous situation," Admiral Hawthorne continued. "Someone who appeared knowledgeable about naval technology but didn't fit standard visitor profiles." Realized his entire approach had been wrong. Instead of gathering information and making reasoned assessments, he had immediately defaulted to rigid protocol enforcement. A real security threat would have exploited his predictable response. Your crew's reaction was particularly interesting, the Admiral noted. Several of them seemed to recognize me, but they deferred to your authority rather than speaking up. That suggests either excellent discipline or poor communication within your command structure. Hadn't noticed his crew's recognition of the Admiral. He had been too focused on his own authority to pay attention to their body language and reactions. Another failure of situational awareness that could have prevented the entire confrontation. The Coca-Cola incident, Admiral Hawthorne said with a slight smile, was admittedly unprofessional, but by that point I wanted to see how you would respond to a completely unexpected action. You were testing my reaction under stress, said, finally understanding the full scope of what had happened. Partially, the Admiral agreed, but I was also responding to your increasingly aggressive demands. Sometimes unconventional situations require unconventional responses. Felt a mixture of relief and continued embarrassment. The Admiral's actions, while shocking, had been part of a deliberate test rather than a random assault. However, his own failure in that test remained a serious concern. "What happens now?" asked, dreading the answer. Admiral Hawthorne returned to her seat and considered the question seriously. "That depends largely on what you've learned from this experience." Took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts despite the discomfort of his sticky uniform and the stress of the situation. "I learned that I need to gather more information before making decisions based on assumptions." Continue. "I should have asked more questions about your purpose and authority rather than immediately demanding credentials," said. "And I should have paid attention to my crew's reactions, which might have provided important information." Admiral Hawthorne nodded approvingly. "What else?" Thought harder, replaying the encounter in his mind. "I let personal pride interfere with sound judgment. I was more concerned about maintaining authority in front of my crew than properly assessing the situation." And the security implications. "A real threat would have exploited my predictable response patterns," admitted. "I followed a rigid protocol that could be easily anticipated and circumvented." Admiral Hawthorne stood again and instinctively straightened despite his disheveled appearance. "Captain, this exercise has revealed both weaknesses and strengths in your command approach." Waited silently, not trusting himself to speak. "Your dedication to security protocols is commendable, and your crew clearly respects your authority," the Admiral continued. "However, your ability to adapt to unexpected situations needs improvement." The words stung, but knew they were fair. He had performed exactly as poorly as someone could in such a scenario. "I'm assigning you to participate in a special training program," Admiral Hawthorne announced. "Advanced Tactical Assessment and Crisis Leadership. It begins next week." Felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Additional training was far better than the court-martial he had been expecting, but it also meant his deficiencies had been officially noted. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "I appreciate the opportunity to improve." Admiral Hawthorne moved toward the cabin door, then paused. "Captain, there's one more thing you should know about today's exercise." Braced himself for additional bad news. "This wasn't my first visit to your ship," the Admiral said. "I've been observing your crew's performance for several weeks in various disguises and roles." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. How many times had the Admiral been present without his knowledge? How many opportunities had he missed to demonstrate proper leadership and situational awareness? "Your crew performed exceptionally well during those previous visits," Admiral Hawthorne continued. "They're well-trained, disciplined, and clearly loyal to you. Today's incident was your first significant failure." Felt a complicated mix of emotions. Pride in his crew's performance warred with humiliation over his own mistakes. The Admiral's words suggested his overall command record remained solid, but today's failure would undoubtedly follow him for years. "The formal fleet inspection will proceed as scheduled," Admiral Hawthorne said. "Your ship will be evaluated on its technical readiness and crew performance, not on today's incident." Nodded gratefully. At least his crew's hard work wouldn't be wasted because of his personal failure. "However," the Admiral added, "I will be watching your performance during that inspection with particular interest." The door opened, and Admiral Hawthorne stepped into the passageway. followed, still sticky and disheveled, but beginning to process the full implications of their conversation. On deck, the crew was still going about their duties, but could sense their heightened awareness of his presence. Word of the encounter had undoubtedly spread throughout the ship, though hopefully without all the embarrassing details. Admiral Hawthorne addressed the assembled crew members. "Carry on with your inspection preparations. Your captain and I have concluded our discussion." Several sailors snapped to attention as she passed, and noticed their crisp military bearing contrasted sharply with his own bedraggled appearance. He would need to clean up quickly and address his crew's concerns about what had transpired. As Admiral Hawthorne reached the gangway leading off the ship, she turned back to one final time. "Captain, I suggest you keep that uniform as a reminder of today's lessons." Looked down at his cola-stained shirt and realized she was right. The physical reminder of his failure would serve as a powerful motivation for improvement. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "I will." Admiral Hawthorne nodded and left the ship, leaving to face his crew and begin the difficult process of rebuilding his authority and confidence. The formal inspection was still 3 days away, but he now understood that his real test had already begun. 3 days later, Captain stood on the deck of the USS Hampton wearing a crisp, newly pressed uniform. The formal fleet inspection was about to begin, and despite his best efforts to project confidence, his mind kept returning to the cola-stained shirt hanging in his quarters as Admiral Hawthorne had suggested. The physical reminder of his failure served its purpose, keeping him humble and focused on the lessons he had learned. The inspection team arrived precisely at 800 hours, led by Commander, a stern officer known for her exacting standards. Had participated in her inspections before and knew she missed nothing. Today, however, he felt a different kind of pressure knowing that Admiral Hawthorne would be observing his performance with particular scrutiny. As the inspection began, made a conscious effort to implement everything he had learned from his encounter with the Admiral. When Commander questioned him about security protocols, he resisted the urge to give rigid, textbook responses. Instead, he explained how his crew had been trained to assess threats dynamically and adapt their responses based on available information. "Tell me about your crew's readiness for unexpected scenarios," Commander said, her tone suggesting this wasn't a standard question. Glanced around the deck and spotted Admiral Hawthorne in the distance, wearing her proper uniform this time, but observing the proceedings with the same sharp attention she had shown during their previous encounter. "We've recently implemented enhanced situational awareness training," replied carefully. "The crew has been practicing responses to ambiguous situations that might not fit standard protocols." Commander raised an eyebrow. "Can you give me a specific example?" Took a deep breath. This was his opportunity to demonstrate that he had truly learned from his mistakes. "Last week, we conducted an exercise where unidentified personnel appeared to be examining sensitive equipment. Rather than immediately confronting them, the crew was trained to gather information, assess the situation comprehensively, and consider multiple possibilities before taking action." "And how did that exercise conclude?" Commander asked. "It revealed important gaps in our assessment procedures that we've since addressed," admitted. "We learned that effective security requires flexibility and critical thinking, not just rigid adherence to protocols." The answer seemed to satisfy Commander, and she moved on to technical inspections. Throughout the morning, continued applying his new understanding of leadership and situational awareness. When junior officers asked questions, he encouraged them to think through problems rather than simply following orders. When unexpected issues arose, he demonstrated the kind of adaptable thinking he had failed to show during his encounter with Admiral Hawthorne. During the crew evaluation portion of the inspection, was particularly proud of how his sailors performed. They demonstrated not only technical competence, but also the kind of intelligent initiative that effective military leadership required. Commander Sarah, his executive officer, had clearly done excellent work maintaining crew morale and performance during the difficult period following his public humiliation. As the formal inspection concluded around noon, Commander gathered her team to compile their findings. Waited nervously, knowing that his ship's performance would reflect not only on his crew's hard work, but also on his own growth as a commander. "Captain," Commander announced, "the USS Hampton has achieved the highest marks in technical readiness, crew performance, and operational preparedness." felt a surge of relief and pride. His crew had performed magnificently despite the stress and uncertainty they had experienced over the past 3 days. However, Commander continued, I'm particularly impressed by the evidence of recent improvements in leadership adaptability and crisis management protocols. Whatever changes you've implemented recently have clearly enhanced your operational effectiveness. Glanced toward Admiral Hawthorne, who was approaching the group with a neutral expression that revealed nothing about her assessment of his performance. Admiral, Commander said, saluting as Hawthorne joined them. The Hampton has exceeded standards in all evaluation categories. Admiral Hawthorne returned the salute and looked directly at. I'm pleased to hear that, Commander. I've been following Captain's recent development with considerable interest. The words carried multiple meanings that only fully understood. The recent development clearly referenced their encounter and its aftermath, but Admiral Hawthorne's tone suggested satisfaction rather than continued concern. After the inspection team departed, Admiral Hawthorne remained on deck to address privately. The crew continued their duties at respectful distances, but could sense their curiosity about this second meeting with their commanding officer. Captain, Admiral Hawthorne said, I observed your performance during today's inspection. Braced himself for feedback, uncertain whether the Admiral's assessment would be positive or negative. Your responses to Commander's questions demonstrated significant improvement in your approach to leadership challenges, she continued. You showed exactly the kind of adaptive thinking that was missing during our previous encounter. Felt cautiously optimistic. Thank you, ma'am. I've been working to implement the lessons from our discussion. Admiral Hawthorne smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he had seen from her. More importantly, your crew's performance today reflected excellent leadership and preparation. They clearly respect and trust your command. The comment meant more to than any personal praise could have. His greatest fear had been that his failure would undermine his crew's confidence in his leadership. I have some additional news for you, Admiral Hawthorne said. The advanced training program I mentioned has been expanded into a fleet-wide initiative. I'd like you to help develop and teach the curriculum. Was stunned. Rather than being marginalized because of his mistakes, he was being asked to help train other officers to avoid similar failures. You'll be working with experienced commanders who have successfully navigated complex crisis situations, the Admiral explained. The goal is to develop training scenarios that test adaptability and judgment rather than just protocol compliance. Realized this was an extraordinary opportunity. His embarrassing encounter with the Admiral, rather than ending his career prospects, was opening new doors for professional growth and contribution. I'm honored by your confidence in me, said. I accept the assignment. Admiral Hawthorne extended her hand for a professional handshake. Captain, the mark of true leadership isn't avoiding mistakes. It's learning from them and helping others do the same. As she prepared to leave the ship, Admiral Hawthorne paused one final time. By the way, how is that cola-stained uniform serving as a reminder? Couldn't help but smile. It's been very effective, ma'am. I look at it every morning before putting on my clean uniform. Excellent, Admiral Hawthorne replied. Keep doing that until you're confident you won't need the reminder anymore. After the Admiral departed, gathered his senior officers to discuss the day's events and their implications for future operations. Commander expressed the crew's relief that the inspection had gone so well, but sensed deeper questions about his encounter with Admiral Hawthorne. Sir, said carefully, the crew has been wondering about your meeting with the Admiral last week. Considered how much to explain. The incident had been humiliating, but it had also provided valuable lessons that could benefit his entire command. I made some serious errors in judgment during an unannounced assessment, admitted. The Admiral helped me understand how those mistakes could have had serious consequences in real operational situations. He went on to explain the lessons he had learned about situational awareness, adaptive thinking, and the dangers of rigid protocol adherence. His officers listened intently, clearly recognizing the value of his experience even if they didn't know all the embarrassing details. The important thing, concluded, is that we use this experience to improve our overall preparedness and effectiveness. Over the following weeks, as began developing curriculum for the new training program, he reflected often on his encounter with Admiral Hawthorne. The humiliation of being doused with Coca-Cola had been profound, but the lessons learned from that experience were transforming his approach to leadership and command. The training scenarios he developed incorporated the kind of ambiguous, challenging situations that tested officers' judgment rather than their memorization of procedures. Each exercise was designed to force participants to gather information, consider multiple possibilities, and adapt their responses based on evolving circumstances. When the first training session was conducted, was surprised to see Admiral Hawthorne among the observing officers. As he led a group of captains through a complex scenario involving unidentified personnel and potential security threats, he noticed the Admiral's approving nods. After the session, Admiral Hawthorne approached him with obvious satisfaction. "Captain, this training program is exactly what the fleet needs. You've taken your personal experience and transformed it into valuable education for others." Felt a deep sense of accomplishment. His greatest professional failure had become the foundation for his most significant contribution to naval training and preparedness. "I've learned that the best lessons often come from our worst mistakes," replied. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to share those lessons with others." 6 months later, Captain received orders for a new assignment, commanding a guided missile cruiser in the Mediterranean fleet. The promotion represented a significant advancement in his career, one that would have seemed impossible in the immediate aftermath of his cola-soaked humiliation. On his final day aboard the Hampton, packed the stained uniform carefully among his personal belongings. The shirt no longer served as a daily reminder of failure, but rather as a symbol of growth and learning. He had kept Admiral Hawthorne's suggestion and continued looking at it each morning until he was confident he had internalized its lessons. As he prepared to transfer command to his replacement, reflected on how dramatically his understanding of leadership had evolved. The encounter with Admiral Hawthorne had been professionally devastating at the time, but it had ultimately made him a better officer and leader. His crew gathered for the traditional change of command ceremony and was moved by their obvious respect and affection. Despite witnessing his public humiliation, they had continued to trust his leadership and had performed magnificently under his command. In his final address to the crew, chose to share the story of his encounter with Admiral Hawthorne, including all the embarrassing details he had previously kept private. The sailors listened with fascination as he described how his pride and rigid thinking had led to spectacular failure, and how that failure had ultimately taught him to be a more effective leader. "The lesson I want you to remember," concluded, "is that our mistakes don't define us unless we fail to learn from them. Every failure is an opportunity to become better at what we do." As the ceremony ended and prepared to leave the Hampton for the last time, he carried with him not just the memory of his humiliation, but also the knowledge that he had transformed that experience into wisdom that would guide him throughout the rest of his career. The cola-stained uniform remained in his possession, a tangible reminder that even the most embarrassing failures could become the foundation for future success. And somewhere in Norfolk, Admiral Hawthorne continued her unconventional assessments of fleet readiness, confident that at least one captain had learned to expect the unexpected.